Hello and welcome back to another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel. Future Frame TV is presented by Traces.Dreams, and I'm here today with Dr. Diego Sanchez-Ancochea. Diego is the director of the Oxford Department of International Development, and it's our pleasure to have you here today and to talk about your recent book. Diego, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I feel so happy to be here with you.
That's great. We're very happy to have you here. Let's start right away with some questions that we have about your book, which is titled Costs of Inequality in Latin America, Lessons and Warnings for the Rest of the World. Of course, this is a very big topic. We all know that inequalities exist in many regions or in all regions of the world. We know that Latin America is one that is for a long time being handicapped by diverse inequalities in all places. But I'd like to know not only what the book is about in general, but specifically about the challenge of looking at Latin America as a region that is actually quite heterogeneous. And how do you come about this book bringing Latin America together as one region?
That's a great question, and probably I don't do a good job enough. And when experts read it, that's what they will find. The book is in some ways not written for Latin Americans, but for people that don't know about Latin America, right? And that particularly written thinking about some countries in Europe and especially the US, which I think are now rediscovering inequality because they already had experienced it at the beginning of the 20th century, and thinking that they are in some ways unique or looking just inside as they always do, instead of trying to look outside and learning from others and learning what are the historical experience of living with high inequality, which I think that's what Latin America brings. And in that sense, I think, and I don't know what you think, given all your own research, but I do think that with all the big differences, there are some similarities between almost all Latin American countries, which are not just inequality, but this issue of concentration at the top, right? The idea that it's not only that everyone is unequal in society, but actually that the top 1% controls a very significant amount of income almost everywhere. Even when you go to Uruguay, it's true that Uruguay and Argentina have less, but from a comparative perspective, they still have relatively high inequality and that power of the elites. So in some ways, that's why I decided to focus on the whole region, while recognizing, obviously, that the history of Guatemala in some ways and the cost of inequality in Latin America, in Guatemala, are very different than Uruguay.
What are the findings that you have in this book? What do you present as lessons and warnings, as the very nice subtitle or very scary subtitle says?
Yes. The book starts by really recognizing that we should not talk about inequality in general, but very much about this concentration at the top and the power of the elites. And in that sense, that the history of Latin America, at least during the 20th century, shows that inequality and the power of the elite leads to a whole set of economic, political, and social costs or impacts or negative impacts. They go from the lack of incentives to innovate and to spend in education. I don't think this is a problem of political capital, but it's very much a problem of certain actors being powerful enough and without incentives to do this, all the way to the political process and the emergence of, with apologies for the term, populisms that responding to certain weaknesses, to issues like how racism, but also urban segregation can be explained and related to inequality. When I was writing the book, I thought I'm going to concentrate on the cost, and then a few friends, including Ben Phillips, that I know has been talking to you as well, told me, well, but I'm sure there's also good and positive lessons. And one of the chapters that makes me happier is one in which I also go with the good lessons, the positive lessons that Latin America brings, particularly in terms of ideas, so structuralism or the theology of liberation in religion, social movements, which I think have been some of the most significant in the world in fighting inequality, and also the policies to reduce inequality in the 2000s. But of course, at the end, I say, yes, there's these positive lessons, but inequality creates such a vicious circles in society that it's just very difficult to overcome it. And that's, for me, the biggest warning is that if you start having too high inequality in places like the US or in the country I live, in the UK, then reducing it will become much harder because of these vicious circles.
Can you talk a little bit more about these vicious circles?
Yes, so let me put in the economic realm, what I say is, look, when the elite is so powerful and is making so much money in a few sectors of the economy where limited competition, they will have very few incentives to innovate, but also to support spending in education. This obviously will lead to lower economic growth. There's obviously other reasons why Latin American countries have not grown enough, but one of them is that inequality has led to insufficient incentives for innovation and human capital. But that low growth in itself creates a dual economy with a very significant informal sector that leads to the perpetuation of inequality over time. And you can say, well, yes, but this is just Latin America. But when you think about the US, even now, the power of the elite means that the education system is becoming increasingly segmented with a few sectors that are very dynamic, but the rest of the economy that is being left behind. And again, that perpetuates inequality over time. Or think about violence. I think there's a lot of research showing that part of the reasons why Latin America is so violent and what some of the highest homicide rates in the world has to do with inequality. But at the same time, that violence affects certain parts of the economy and society much more than others, leading to low investment in those regions, in those parts of the cities, and that perpetuating inequality. And I think that's what is particularly worrying, is this issue that inequality leads to bad outcomes, but those bad outcomes tend to then feed back into inequality as well.
Can we do something about that, or are we doomed?
Well, you have worked as much as I have done in policies, and I think we can. But should I put it? I think it's important to recognize how possible it is, but how difficult it is at the same time, right? So being realist, but also dream about change is important. And I think how to think about breaking those circles is a lot about how we think about new policies, but especially about new politics. The book finishes with a whole chapter on policies and politics, which is not very original. So I don't have any big recipes, I'm afraid, because I think it's actually going back to the basis. I do think that democratic institutions, for example, are today as important as ever. It's not about imagining a different type of organizing society, but that we need to take how do we strengthen political parties seriously, right? And when we think about the country you know so much more about, Mexico, I think part of the problem is that we have replaced relatively strong but dysfunctional political parties by a movement that is not truly creating a new institutional structure around politics. And that's the challenge, is how we create a new, or how we recreate a new kind of democracy in which political parties link to social movements and start putting pressures on the elites. No, it's not easy. And again, as your own work shows, the elites are not particularly enthusiastic about it, but I think that's one area.
That's a way of framing it.
Yes. The other, which in a way I would ask you, is what you think about ideas and values, right? So some of your research shows, I think in a very interesting way, that people know in Latin America that they are living in very unequal environments. They know very well the inequality, but they don't always want to do something about it or support the right policies. I wonder whether we can change that equilibrium in people's lives and they can understand that the only way to reduce the inequality they're upset about is to support some of those policies. And how do we do that in terms of ideas? It's a big challenge, I guess.
It's a very big challenge, and I mean, it was not a trick question. It's an honest question whether we can do something about it, because we know the policies. And as you say, it's not particularly innovative to say that we need stronger institutional and democratic institutional frameworks. We need better taxation system. We need more redistribution, etc. It's fairly straightforward if we want to do something about the distribution of income, right, or even of wealth. The question underlying this question is maybe that of the role of power, right? I mean, one thing is, as you say, values or attitudes or on a personal level, but then there is also something about structural power of those concentrated elites. Do you find any solution for that underlying problem or any intuition?
So less in this book, but more in other work that I'm trying to do, I do think that when one thinks about why some Latin American countries are less unequal than others, even within the region, the role of politics becomes extremely important, right? So when you think about countries like Uruguay, Argentina, and even Costa Rica, yes, you can talk all you want about a long history of a different colonial experience, etc. But the truth is that at that some point in the 20th century, they had the development of political parties from the left that were the ones behind pressuring the elite to do policies differently. They were the ones strengthening the state to try to do new policies. And in general, although not always, they were doing both things at the same time. One is linked to political and social movements quite effectively, but also creating a progressive technocracy. I talk with my friend and my colleague Juliana Martinez Franzoni in the work we have done together, a progressive technopoliticians. I think those are the three key ingredients for me, right? Is how do we recreate the left? How do we have state actors, both politicians but also civil servants that buy the progressive ideas? And then the third is how we link to social movements. If I can move from Latin America for a second to Spain, one of the reasons why the link between the Indignados and Podemos was so exciting is that some of us thought that they would recreate a new way of linking social movements with political parties. And I think the experience has a lot of positive lessons, but also negative lessons of how this is possible, but also extremely difficult in the current environment.
What do you think makes it possible in some cases?
I think what makes the left possible is a variety of reasons, but one of the standard explanation for people like us, for academics, would be that this is a very historical process, a long history. I think it's also about using specific windows of opportunity well, right? So if one thinks about the history of Costa Rica, for example, and the 1940s, that was a moment in which there was very significant instability, where we were internationally having the whole Second World War and all the instability that created. And there were a whole set of new leaders that used that opportunity to create a new political party and to create a new discourse. I think how both social movements themselves, but also political leaders use window of opportunities. And of course, this leads to the question of whether we are living one of them, right? Whether COVID-19 could be one of them is one of the issues to think about. But as I tell you this, I have to be very honest, I realize how unsatisfactory the answer is precisely because of what you said before, right? Because of how difficult and how unique has been the history of those countries that have been successful at doing this.
I think that's a very good answer, actually, and especially because it highlights this challenge, but also because it shows that answers have to be idiosyncratic, right? And we have to take context into consideration. And I mean, on your hope of this, or I assume that it's a hope that this situation might change, this COVID pandemic situation might change for the better in some political aspects. In Mexico, it's a very critical situation, right? We hope that nominally left government would institute some programs of support and some turn of politics, and not much has happened in that direction, for example, right? So it's very unpredictable in a way whether these contexts lead into one direction or into another. And it highlights very nicely what you say, the importance and the power of politics, right? And I have an unanswered question or doubt myself about one of the aspects of inequality in relation to this importance of politics, which is the even more unequal distribution of wealth in comparison to the distribution of income, right? I mean, you focus a lot more on income, and that has something to do, I suspect, with the unavailability of wealth data as well. But I was wondering whether you have some comments on difference or on the relation of wealth and inequality in Latin America as well.
So I wonder, before I answer the question, whether I can ask you one, finishing this discussion, but actually related with this issue of power. When one has to think about Mexico in particular, one can say, okay, López Obrador has done what he has done primarily because he has pressures from the elite and those wealthy, but that doesn't seem to be a very good explanation, right? So I think in Mexico in particular, thinking about the counterfactual of what would have happened if López Obrador would have been a true leftist leader, and whether that's one of the key windows of opportunity, whether actually political power from democratic institutions sometimes could be enough to try to reduce some of the power of the elites. And in that case, how much of a missed opportunity Mexico is. So I guess I would love to hear your opinions on this. I think it relates very much to your question of wealth. There's no doubt that when we think about the power of the elite, is not primarily built on income, even if as you say, I discuss income in the book, but it's primarily built on wealth, right? Is in their ability to control all the means of production in a very Marxist way, and also of controlling so much resources that allow them to pay political parties, etc., that's really at the root of the problem. You are right that given how difficult it is to find data, we continue talking about income, but there's very little doubt that the deeper structural power of the elites is based on wealth.
Well, I have a very short answer to your question from my side. I think it's very difficult to have the counterfactual because, well, in my eyes, the current government is not a left-wing government. I mean, it's pretty obvious that they have a discourse of anti-neoliberalism, and then they pursue very similar politics of what was pursued under so-called neoliberal governments, right? So in practice, we don't actually have a situation here where you could check this counterfactual. I think it's helpful there to use your methodology and go to other Latin American countries where there were governments that have managed to institute, to take Brazil, for example, institute some more redistributive policies, for example, in terms of minimum wage policy. And that, well, actually, that does happen in Mexico right now. So there is an appreciation of the minimum wage level, and that is significant, and that is apparently very successful. So in some aspects, small aspects, maybe there is a tendency to improve the situation. I think in relation to what you also mentioned, my own research, the problem is that there's still a lot of focus on how to deal with the poorest groups. That is, augment the minimum wage policy, which is very important, social assistance programs, which are very important, but it doesn't address this other, the concentration of power and wealth and income, which now coincides, right? And historically, it was not always the same people that had high incomes and high wealth. And now it happens to be so that mostly those people that are already wealthy, they also have high incomes, right? So if we don't look at that part of the distribution, there is, I think, no way that we can get a dent into inequalities in the region.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think is one of the problems of the pink tide was that, right? That the rhetoric was not always accompanied by significant attempts to shift the distribution of wealth, creating a new tax system, creating new competition policy. And competition policy advanced relatively little across the region. So we only need to think about governments like Correa, which in many ways did a lot of exciting things, but in terms of thinking about power, exactly as you say, they were so bad, right? So I think for me, Correa is the best illustration of how bad it was for two reasons. One is what you say, which is they did very little to actually erode the underlying power of people like Novoa or the key sectors of the economy. But at the same time, they systematically weakened social movements because they were worried about the power of social movements in the state. So at the end, you end up that when he left, you were left with exactly the same politics Ecuador had for the last 50 or 60 or 70 years. And is this lack of understanding, I think in some ways, of course, is the difficulties that we are discussing of eroding structural power. But I also think that sometimes is a lack of a theory of power, that they don't understand that this is a process that is going to last for many, many years, that is going to take a long time, and therefore that they need to think about how to slowly erode the power of the elites and at the same time how to gradually strengthen social movements for the long run. And maybe in Bolivia is a slightly better story, but in general, I think that's the problem, is the lack of the theory of power.
I think that's a very interesting insight. And I mean, it plays into intertwining, right, of the political and the economic elites. I mean, if you're part of that yourself, you might not want to undermine yourself too much.
Mm-hmm. That totally. I think that's a very good point, that they are much more intertwining than we think. And that the challenge that I see that would be much more for the economic elite, they see it as themselves. And again, Correa is a very good example of that.
Diego, you're from Spain. You're not from Latin America, but
Mhm.
well, you've been the director of the Latin American Center in Oxford, and you've researched this region for a long time. But what made you interested in Latin America in the first place, or in studying these subjects?
So I studied a long time ago, sadly now, economics in my undergraduate in Madrid. And one of the people, Jose Luis San Pedro, that then was a very novelist, he never taught me, but he had taught people that then taught me. And he actually defines economics as the science of poverty, not the science of allocating resources and any other definitions that people do. And there was a very significant accent on development and on thinking very seriously about places. And as you were saying, the history of specific places. Then, when I had to do my PhD, I'm thinking about, I clearly wanted to do it on development. And I wanted to do it in a place that I could both understand, but at the same time do field work, etc. And obviously, Latin America was very close to Spain. I increasingly understand that development is as much about understanding the region than understanding your own place, where you come from. And I think that's what has at the end been exciting, that by understanding Latin America, you actually can also understand places like Spain. You can clearly understand the US. I mean, I have spent several years in the US at different moments. I increasingly think that the US is more a Latin American country than they ever think about. And clearly, the last few weeks have reinforced, I think, that view for many of us.
I think that's a fantastic insight to look at this relationality, right? That it's a relationship of mutual influence between what you research in terms of development and where you are standing in terms of developed or underdeveloped or overdeveloped or whatever you want to use the terms for these countries. I think it's important to consider the place we come from and the one we look at, right? To understand both. We're coming to a close almost of our fantastic conversation here. Is there anything you'd like to add in terms of insights of your book or of what you recently been researching now after the book is done?
So the first is that everyone should understand, and again, I think your podcast, your work, I hope my work and others show it very clearly, that inequality is truly one of the challenges of the 21st century because it affects every dimension of our lives, right? It's impossible for those that are interested in climate change to think about climate change without thinking about the consequences of concentration at the top and poverty at the bottom. It's impossible to think about new types of politics without thinking about it. So that would be the first insight that we have touched, but I would emphasize once more. The second is this idea that we keep talking about inequality, especially economies, when you hear about economies, as if it is that everyone is unequal, that we are all individuals, we organize, we can order ourselves from the richest to the poorest. And no, I think there's two types of inequality that are significant, one more significant than the other, but that we should separate. So one is concentration at the top. And that's important exactly for the reasons you were saying, that reflects concentration of wealth and reflects concentration of political power. And the second is inequality between different groups within the workers, right? And I think that's very clear that that's also important. For me, less important, but important, during COVID. The fact is that you and I are quite upset about the state of our own lives, but we can continue going on. We don't have to worry about where our salary will come from. We can have this conversation. There's many other people in society that actually, if they don't go out and find a job, they will not know how to survive. And we tend to link those two types of inequality because they are related, but they are also distinguished, and we should distinguish them much more. Again, I know you did work with Gabriel Palma, which in some ways we can think about that message partly when he divides between different groups in society. And then the third is how we need to combine formal and informal politics to think about the responses that you were saying. So Ben Phillips and I were in the same university for a few months a couple of years ago. We were doing each of us our own book. And one of the places where we discuss a lot is that he basically has this idea that if we change the politics from the bottom, everything will change. I actually think that formal politics is extremely important as well. And in fact, that the key challenge is how we link the informal and the formal. how we almost recreate the type of link between trade unions and social democratic parties that existed in several European countries in the 20th century. And I think we need to be creative in how we do that, but that's actually the primary goal, is that recreation between the power of the state and the power of the people. And hopefully we can not just do more research, but more conversations with people on the ground, people working on these issues on how to think about those two things.
Diego, thank you so much. These are excellent insights. And I love the idea of bringing together formal and informal politics. I mean, basically everything we do, if it's not formal politics, it's definitely informal politics. So we should consider all of our actions there. You should consider your actions towards a better, more equal and more just environment in all levels of life. Thank you, Diego, for joining us for this episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel. And if you like these topics or if you would like to know more about inequalities, please join us again next Saturday for another episode right here. And if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That helps us to gauge your interest. And you can also comment there if you would like to know something about this specific aspect of inequality that we haven't touched yet on the channel. Thanks again for watching and have a nice afternoon. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks.